the Neurokrish Immersion, and we're very excited to welcome Dr. Dawson Church, who is a well-known author and researcher at the interface between science and spirituality. Welcome, Dr. Church.
It is so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you for waking up so early to be on this podcast. I thought I would ask you to help us by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your work. I think it'll be good for our listeners to know what you do and all the wonderful things that you're doing.
I'd be happy to. And what I do focus on mostly now is training people in both stress reduction and in reaching transcendent states. And the two things go together because there are many examples of great spiritual masters who reach transcendent states. But unless you also heal psychological trauma, and many of us, even if we weren't psychologically traumatized to a deep degree as children, we have unfinished business from our past. And so unless you go and clear that, then reaching those transcendent states leaves you with a backlog of that unhealed material. So I train people both in stress reduction techniques and psychological clearing techniques to really take that backlog of unhealed childhood material and remove all of the both the psychological and the physiological wounding that's caught up there. I did a very key study, which has been cited over 300 times, on cortisol about 20 years ago. And we found that as people are using these techniques to reduce stress, their cortisol levels drop precipitously and their levels of immunoglobulins and other immune factors rise dramatically. So we want to go ahead and do that both at physiological and psychological clearing. And then the other thing is to use meditation, use spiritual intelligence to reach these elevated states. And that's really what's been interesting me for my whole professional career. I've been meditating for almost 60 years, and that combination of those two things I find critical, and that's informed the more than 200 studies I've been involved with, and also my both popular psychology and my psychology textbooks that I've written or contributed to.
Wonderful. It's great to know because in this podcast we often explore the borderlands between neuroscience and philosophy and mental health and spirituality. You've been described as someone who builds bridges between science and spirituality. What got you off on this journey, and how would you describe that journey?
People often assume there's like this underlying assumption that there is this gap or lack of connection or even conflict between science and spirituality. And nothing is further from the truth. Science is a way of measuring things. And what the beauty of modern tools, especially MRIs and EEGs, we have these highly advanced brain imaging systems now. And so in previous generations, before we had those in the 1960s, 1950s, we knew when people were having elevated states of consciousness that something was going on, and we could measure those. And so early research used, for example, a researcher called Hood developed something called the Mystical Experiences Questionnaire, or MEQ, in the 1970s. And that was really useful for giving us an insight into what the mystical experience looked like. Really, really good questionnaire. But what MRIs then gave us, starting in the 1990s, was a picture of what was happening in the brains of those people. So science allows us to measure these things. We can measure neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, anandamide, beta endorphins. And so that is this measuring tool. And that is so useful because now we don't just know that someone's having a mystical experience. We can measure it. We can measure it with things like cortisol. We can measure it with neurotransmitters like anandamide. And then we can measure brain function with an MRI or an EEG. And that tells us the actual empirical quantity of change. And so what these scientific tools have given us is the ability to measure these states. And what we're finding is that the magnitude, the order of magnitude of change that people experience physiologically is enormous. I'll just give you one example from a study that's been published recently that was a replication of several earlier studies over the last 5 years. And this study took The population was people with Alzheimer's disease. They had now Alzheimer's disease is a disease that produces all kinds of behavioral change. It produces dramatic brain shrinkage. So in my book, Spiritual Intelligence, I have an image of two brains post-mortem, one a normal 65-year-old brain, the other the brain of an Alzheimer's patient who died at 65, these two brains side by side. And the Alzheimer's brain has shrunk by 70%, 70%. The Alzheimer's brain is this little tiny thing rattling around in this great big skull. 70% shrinkage of the Alzheimer's brain. So these researchers took these Alzheimer's patients who already had brain shrinkage, who had the buildup of beta amyloid and tau tangles in their brains, and they also had severe cognitive decline. They taught them to meditate using highly specific body-based tools. And again, general meditation can be useful, but a lot of things people think about meditation, core meditation, are actually, when you put people in an MRI, not producing brain change. But certain highly specific practices are producing brain change. And that's what these researchers had these Alzheimer's patients do half an hour a day for 6 months. And they thought that they might see a slowing in that rate of cognitive decline, a slowing in neural tissue loss. And what they were amazed to discover, and I tell this whole story in chapter 2 of my book, Spiritual Intelligence, these researchers were absolutely astonished when the results came in after 6 months to find out that these Alzheimer's brains had actually stopped shrinking and begun growing in key parts of the brain that we associate with meditation, like the executive functions of the brain, like those parts that handle emotion regulation. So what we're seeing as we apply the tools of science to what we think of it as spiritual pursuits. I mean, what's more spiritual than sitting and meditating for half an hour every day? What we're finding as we apply the tools of science to measure spirituality is that it's producing dramatic physiological changes, sometimes a drop of 40% or more in cortisol. In one of my clinical trials, a comparison of people after 1 week of using these techniques to remove trauma to produce higher states, a 113% increase in immunoglobulins, our immune markers. So we're using science now to measure these states and finding they're producing massive shift in our neurophysiology. And that's really the exciting frontier, I think, of spirituality and science.
Wonderful. I mean, we have in this podcast explored, for example, how seizures and spiritual seekers tend to have a number of interactions. There are so many descriptions of this, in history and in neuroscience. You've defined spiritual intelligence as the ability of human consciousness to interact with the universal consciousness. How do you distinguish this from, intelligence, IQ or EQ, and why do you see spiritual quotient as humanity's next evolutionary step?
There are a lot of reasons why spiritual intelligence is our next step. For one thing, we are changing as a species very, very quickly. And a lot of this is a two-edged sword in that part of our social cultural evolution now is driven by the threat of extinction. And when a species is threatened with extinction, it really focuses your mind. Benjamin Franklin said 300 years ago, he said that nothing concentrates a man's mind as wonderfully as the prospect of being hanged tomorrow. So we're faced with extinction and we have all these evolutionary pressures on us from climate change, from species extinction, from social inequality, racial inequality, income inequality, all of these enormous issues that are facing our planet. And this is pushing us into an evolutionary shift. And what we're finding is that I discuss this extensively in chapter 7 of Spiritual Intelligence, is that when, for example, large-scale polls measure people's level of happiness, and these polls are done annually, they publish the annual review of happiness levels for every country in the world. And what we're finding is that people in the bottom, roughly one-fifth of the population distribution, are becoming more and more and more unhappy. And there's a lot to be unhappy about in the world. I mean, there are all these problems, global crises going on. And so that is producing a drop. So, for example, in the US, the number of young men who are at the bottom percentile, and that's actually called, this is a kind of a popular word, but it's also a word used in these research studies, despair, absolute despair about their lives. The percentage of people in that bottom rung of despair has doubled in the last 30 years. And the number for that's for young men doubling. The number of young women, it's tripled in the last 30 years. So what we find at the bottom of the scale is people are really, really unhappy. And in some countries, in fact, in India and in Mexico, for example, 20% of the population, when polled, puts themselves on the bottom rung of the ladder, 0 out of 10 for happiness. And my heart just is so saddened by that statistic that so many people feel the sense of despair because those same polls find that at the top of the ranking, and this is independent of money or socioeconomic status, these are the meditators. These are the people who are paying attention to spiritual intelligence. They are going in exactly the opposite direction. They're happier than they've ever been. And so spiritual intelligence I define as that ability of our immediate consciousness. You're conscious, I'm conscious, we're all conscious at that level of awareness that is able to drop its sense of separation from the consciousness of the whole. We know there's universal consciousness. We know from the work of some really important physicists now, we know from many experiments that consciousness is a field that underlies all of what we think of as objective reality. So our individual consciousness is able to literally move into oneness with that consciousness. And we can now, again, science allows us to measure that phenomenon. We can measure something called transcendence. And in some of my research, we measure people's movement into these transcendent states where they lose their addiction, their being embedded in local individual consciousness and move into oneness. And ancient texts like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras describe this. The work of Shankara in the 600s talks about in the crest jewel of illumination about our ability to enter these elevated states. And so for thousands of years, these great philosophers have been describing the ability of the local human experience to release its grip on immediate consciousness and reality and move into oneness with infinite reality. And so that's what spiritual intelligence, it's so relevant because suddenly people having these transcendent experiences act differently. Just for example, pollution. If I've just spent an hour in meditation with a sense of oneness with the all that is, I'm not going to go out and injure somebody else. I'm not going to go out and pollute the planet. I'm not going to hurt my body. I'm not going to act uncompassionately to those around me. It produces massive shifts in behavior. And it's a framework. Spiritual intelligence is a framework for loving everybody and connecting with everybody, including your own body and including nature. So spiritual intelligence, as people move into these transcendent states, affects how they act, how they think, how they love, how they treat those around them, how they treat the planet, how they treat animals. And this trend is apparent in big data and big studies in various ways. So that's what spiritual intelligence is. It's our individual ability to release our addiction, our absorption in everyday reality, and move into oneness with the all that is, that also happens to make you incredibly happy because you have a sense of well-being when you feel that connection. And then as you move back after your meditation into everyday reality, you act, think, and feel very, very differently toward your body, toward your fellow human beings, to animals, to all living beings, to the planet. and it has a pervasive effect all around us. So that's why I wrote the book, Spiritual Intelligence, to talk about this phenomenon, to illuminate the research showing we all have these brain structures that literally are inbuilt in our brains that predispose us to these elevated states, and then how we can start to live those lives effectively moving beyond our preoccupation with our individual consciousness and into service for the whole planet.
Which brings me quite nicely to my question about, the Enlightenment Network and how you see it as the neural signature, of spiritual intelligence. Would you like to tell us a little more about the Enlightenment Network?
I was just amazed when I began to read this research, and it sprang from an event that happened in my personal life in 2017, and it was the date was October the 9th, 2017, and my wife woke me up in the middle of the night. She shook me by the shoulder. I looked at my alarm clock. It said 12:45, early in the morning. I looked outside. I our house window, and I saw a wildfire that was tearing down the valley next to us toward our home. And I just yelled at her, "We're getting out of here right now." And we threw on clothing, we grabbed our phones, we sprinted out to our car as the world was dissolving in this just hellscape of ash and cinders and flames, and there were all these gas tanks exploding, propane tanks exploding in the flames. We drove out as all the trees above our head were catching fire, and we just barely escaped with our lives. 5,000 homes were consumed in that wildfire. Many people lost their lives, and we just got out with seconds to spare. So in one cataclysmic night, we lost our home, all our possessions. A lot of our neighbors were burned in the fire, and so our lives changed very quickly. And we found ourselves homeless. We found ourselves with no possessions other than our phones, the clothes on our back, and our car. And that was the beginning of a couple of years of that were very difficult for us. So, as meditators, we immediately, even the next morning, when we reached safety, we meditated. And the next day we meditated. And the following days we meditated. And we obviously had a lot of very difficult times then. But what I began to realize after about 6 months was that nothing had shaken us. We never felt as though we were going to die, even in the midst of running out of the flames. We had the sense of inner peace that was unshakable. And that's what meditation produces. It produces extraordinary resilience. And you look at the lives of great people like, your namesake, Dr Krishnamurti, or Thich Nhat Hanh, or Mother Teresa, these people of enormous spiritual intelligence. They did not have easy lives for the most part, and yet they maintained that sense of inner peace. So we discovered that peace was there. I began to get curious about the neurotransmitters in my brain. What was happening? Why was I so happy when I had nothing? And so that led to the research on all the neurotransmitters that are active in the brains of meditators, and then reading the MRI studies on these four brain regions that are active in meditators. They're very clearly delineated by neuroscience. The first one I focus on is emotion regulation. And we have these sets of neural bundles in different parts of our brain that work together to regulate negative emotion. So bad things happen to us. My house burned down. I had a lot of other problems after that. I had financial problems. I had physical health problems. But again, you have emotion regulation, so you can regulate anger, frustration, guilt, shame, all of the things that go on in your emotional realm. And these monks and nuns that are studied have excellent emotion regulation after spiritual practice. The other thing they have is the ability to control their focus on the self. They don't find themselves wrapped up in themselves. They're able to relate and connect with other people. The other networks that are active are the ones that focus on empathy, compassion. The empathy network is highly active. And the fourth one is the attention network. They can pay really good attention to what's in front of them. So these four networks together work together as the Enlightenment Network, and it's highly active in these monks and nuns we study in these MRI trials. And we find their levels of happiness are way beyond the scale of normal human well-being. They have 25 times the amount of gamma waves in their brains of the average person. So they're unbelievably happy as measured by these brain states. And so I began to research those networks and then realized that every human being, the most miserable human being in that 20% that's in despair, they have the Enlightenment Network as well. It's just not turned on. The stress network is turned on, and the stress network attenuates the activity of the Enlightenment Network. If you're stressed, then your Enlightenment Network gets shut down. If you meditate effectively, then you dial down your stress, and the Enlightenment Network pops on. And that's when you feel really happy despite all the things going on around you. And you have that resilience. It also sparks brain change, brain regeneration in those four circuits, and then find yourself much more resilient, much more joyful, much more creative than the average person. So that's what the four circuits are. We all had them, and the tragedy of those people in despair is they've got all the hardware in their brains for ecstasy. It's just turned off by stress. So that's why we have to focus on reducing stress, releasing stress, so we can then enter these elevated states of consciousness.
Wonderful. I think I'll take the opportunity to remind our listeners that we've done a whole podcast on the monk's brain in one of our previous episodes, and it's probably a good time to go back and listen to all the research on what happens when you meditate, and what you're referring to, all the wonderful research on monks when they meditate and nuns when they meditate. You've also talked about the caveman brain, the default mode network, and you've contrasted that with the bliss brain. Would you care to sort of enlighten us on that?
Well, one of the reasons that those people are in despair, why this one-fifth of humankind is in despair, and why many people feel so much fear, so much anxiety, is that that's what evolution trained our brains to do. It's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the most fearful. Because if you were afraid, you would run away and you'd get out of danger. So our brains evolved to run away, fight or flight. And fight was more likely to get you killed, flight was more likely to help you survive. And like our brains just evolved in this environment in which it was crucial that we pay attention to what was bad or wrong or out of place in our environment. And the example I use in spiritual intelligence is I have two hypothetical girls, teenage girls, that were living in a jungle 500,000 years ago, and their job was to carry water from the stream up to the village. And one of them was really happy. She was just a really happy-go-lucky person dispositionally. Her sister, had a genetic mutation that made her really unhappy, paranoid. She was one of those people in despair. So here she is, she's 15 years old. She's just in this miserable state all the time, looking for the bad things happening in the village and in herself and in the people in her tribe. And so they're every day their job is to walk from the river, carrying water up to the village. And so one day they're walking up the path, and there's a hungry tiger in the grass about to spring. And the girl, who's so paranoid, is scanning the horizon for threats because of this genetic mutation that helps her do that more. And the other woman is really happy. Well, the paranoid person finds the tiger, sees the tiger, identifies the tiger first, and that gene clicks on that produces cortisol. She starts screaming and running 1 nanosecond before her sister. She gets out of danger. Her happy sister becomes lunch for the tiger. So you have that happen. You have the happy people get weeded out of the gene pool generation after generation. The people who have the fastest cortisol response are then propagating, and repeat this for 10,000 generations, and you have people like us who can sit here. I mean, I tested people for cortisol sitting in the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria five-star hotel in New York, and their cortisol level looks like they're in the jungle, you know? So we have these completely inappropriate stress responses in an environment now that has very, very few predators ready to jump out and eat us. So that's why this is so important that we learn to tame caveman brain. It was highly adaptive for our ancestors. It's highly maladaptive now. Stressed people, by turning on the stress response, that high cortisol produces all kinds of bad things in our bodies now. High cortisol is linked to fast skin wrinkling. It's linked to the loss of muscle mass as we age, the loss of bone density. It's linked to calcification of neurons in the learning centers of the brain. I mean, the list of deficits from cortisol high cortisol is enormous. And stressed people, according to a recent US government large scale long term study, die 24 years earlier than people who are taking care of themselves. People who are not taking care of themselves, who are stressed physically and emotionally, die 24 years younger. There's this massive health span gap that opens up there. And so it is literally killing us to have all that negative thinking going on. So that's why it's just vital to dial down caveman brain. You got to learn these stress reduction techniques. I teach them in the book Spiritual Intelligence. We have live classes. We have a network of trainers that trains people all over the world. You have to learn to attenuate your stress so you can move into these higher states. If you're trying to meditate, for example, you sit there on your meditation cushion, close your eyes, and you're stressed, you'll start thinking about negative stuff. We work with a lot of veterans. We're working now in Ukraine with psychologists who are treating Ukrainian children and veterans and civilians. And when they can't meditate, they close their eyes, they try and meditate. Horror scenes fill their minds. They're still stuck in stress. We have to get them out of that state to give them a sense of inner peace. So that's the first requirement here, is to dial down caveman brain to counteract those old evolutionary tendencies that are built, they're hardwired into your brain, but so is enlightenment. So if you dial one down, you have a chance of turning the second set of brain regions on.
Such an interesting concept. And I was going to say, as an aside, the chap sitting in Waldorf Astoria is probably worried about whether he can afford the coffee, and that's what's dialing my brain. So the triggers exist; they're just different from what they used to be. Yeah. Um, I wanted to, ask you about this concept of the tipping point, where you say that spiritual practice stops being a fleeting state and becomes a stable trait. It makes a seeker into a finder. Would you like
Well,
to uh, enlarge on that?
yeah, so the tipping point is chapter 3 of the book. And each chapter of the book concludes with deepening practices and free resources. So what you'll find as you read Spiritual Intelligence is you're being guided, for example, with a free meditation every single chapter that will help you experience what's there in the chapter. Chapter 1 is all about those four regions of the brain. Chapter 2 is all about neurogenesis, how quickly our brains change. Like I use the example of working out our muscles, how you go to the gym, you start pressing weights, your muscles get bigger, but very slowly. Start working out parts of your brain, and there are parts of the brain that are growing 10% a month when you start to use them. So I emphasize how much quicker parts of our neural network grow than our muscles do. Chapter 2 is all about that, how parts of our brain, especially parts that are stimulated by meditation, begin to grow. And what happens after they grow to a certain stage is we awaken. We've literally built the neural capacity for these enlightened states. So we build it gradually by spiritual intelligence, by the practices of spiritual intelligence, practices like spending time with people who are in these elevated states. If you have a chance to study with a spiritual master or be around people who are entering these states, it's going to accelerate your development. If you abstain from practices like violent media, that are going to disturb your ability to enter these states. That's going to help you. Meditation, though, is the really pinnacle of these practices, but only certain kinds of meditation. So I cover those in chapter 2. And then chapter 3 is when you've built enough capacity in the brain, suddenly reach the tipping point and you enter awakening. And this is a really misunderstood aspect of spiritual awakening. We think it's spiritual, and it is partly, but it's highly neurological. If you don't have enough tissue in the in those certain circuits of the Enlightenment Network, if you don't have enough neural capacity, you just can't get past the tipping point into those elevated states. And so you have to use an effective meditation technique. I give you those for free at the end of each chapter of spiritual intelligence. And I also give you images, like there is one from a scanning electron microscope showing two neurons that are firing together. And you see them in real time. They're like twitching as they fire together. They start to grow together. They touch and they interweave. Now they've wired together. And then you look at the length of time it took to do that, to go from firing to wiring, 12 seconds. So every 12 seconds, you are in that elevated state. You're building a new neural circuit. Eventually, you build up enough of them, you reach the tipping point, and spontaneously, you wake up one day, like I did one day after the fire, and I had nothing materially. I'd lost everything physically, and yet I was in ecstasy. How can this be? You reach the tipping point, and suddenly you find yourself in these elevated states. So you don't need a disaster, you don't need a tragedy to do that. Just consistent practice of certain meditative techniques, some ancient ones. Again, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are a good way to start. The work of the Buddha has a lot of great techniques. These are old techniques. What we do nowadays in science is we reinterpret them through the lens of MRI studies and find that certain ones produce very, very rapid neurogenesis. And suddenly you reach the tipping point. You've been working out your inner neural muscles for a long enough time, building up more and more capacity, firing and wiring every 12 seconds. You've got a new neural connection happening. You build that neural bundle big enough, and one day, suddenly, meditation's easy. Your whole life starts to shift. You have that resilience to meet, whether it's the fire, whether it's the divorce, whether it's the financial downturn, whether it's the sickness, whatever it is, the crisis is in your life. We all have tragedies in our lives, but you are resilient. You have the ability, like Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz, to meet adversity. There are people nowadays, there are a lot of stories in the book of people with spiritual intelligence. I tell the story of Pope John Paul II, shot in Vatican Square by Mehmet Agi Agca, a Turkish zealot who shot him at close range, 6 bullets through his body, and he barely recovered. They thought he was going to die, and yet he recovered. 2 years later, he was in the prison with his would-be assassin, holding his hand and praying with him. So there are all these examples in the book of people with spiritual intelligence, Joan of Arc, and all of these ancient examples, modern examples of people who forgave, and the huge difference it will make in your life. You are resilient. You don't necessarily have an easy life. You might still have a fire, or be lose your job, or get sick, whatever it might be, but you have this quality of resilience, not as a theoretical psychological trait, as a hardwired neurological state. You reach the tipping point and you have an inner joy that nothing can take away from you.
Wonderful. You've talked about the importance of compassion, but you've also talked about the importance of embedding happiness, gratitude, and awe as traits rather than as temporary states. Would you like to expand on these concepts and how they are important for development of spiritual intelligence?
Yeah, one of the cool things about these MRI studies is we can have people in different states and measure their brain activity. And we can also measure neurogenesis. How are their brains changing as they do this? And so one of the case histories in the book is a TV host called Graham Phillips, who had no spiritual practice, but had read about how meditation helps your health and your well-being. So he signed up for a 2-month meditation practice. But he first took his whole TV crew into an advanced neuroscience lab, and they recorded him getting a series of MRI scans, a whole bunch of tests for an entire day. And these neuroscientists mapped every single region of his brain. He then began to meditate, began to become mindful. And after 2 or 3 weeks, his behavior was very, very different. When he went back into the lab after 8 weeks, they did this exhaustive MRI analysis, region by region, of his brain, and they found that the emotion regulation central circuit, it's called the dentate gyrus, they found his dentate gyrus in 8 weeks had grown by 22.8%. Now think about that. Mindfulness for 2 months, and a core part of your brain that regulates anger, fear, frustration, overwhelm, resentment, all these negative emotions, that part of your brain is 22.8% bigger in only 2 months. So now you have the physical mass, neural mass, to regulate negative emotion. Your life suddenly becomes much bigger. What we find in these monks and nuns is that they don't just grow that part of the brain and then develop the ability to regulate negative emotion. That ability is like a rheostat, a dimmer switch. You downregulate negative emotion. What the startling finding is, though, from this research is that you can use that same rheostat, that same dimmer switch, to upregulate positive emotion. So in my classes, for example, in the little exercises at the end of every chapter of the book, I give people the exercises that they can use to not just downregulate negative emotion, you can use that same tissue to upregulate positive emotion. So you're feeling good. My wife and I will do this sometimes. We'll say, how happy are you? And we'll say, oh, I'm 85% happy. And we think, well, what would it take to be 90% happy or 95% or 100% happy? Let's dial it up. So you gain the ability to dial up positive emotion as well as downregulate negative emotion. And that's a powerful ability that these people gain. So as we look at these monks and nuns, as we look at their abilities, as we see how to apply these insights to normal people, we find that they have these dramatically happier lives as a result.
Wonderful. You've talked about flow states, and you link them in people like athletes, artists, or even teams with the awakened brain. So, how does spiritual quotient intersect with creativity and peak performance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is a very poorly understood area of science. I think we'll see a lot more work on this in the next few decades. But there are uh, a couple of things going on here. There was one of the real insights into the brain was gained in the 1960s. So the EEG was invented by Hans Berger, a German doctor, in the late 1920s. After a lot of experimentation, he figured out how to put electrodes on the scalp and read brain waves. And then a uh, a British engineer called Maxwell Cade in the 1950s became really curious about what was going on in the brains of enlightened people. He was a friend of Swami Muktananda, and so he hooked Muktananda up to an EEG, and he found some really interesting brainwave patterns there. And eventually he developed his own EEG called the Mind Mirror. And he eventually hooked up many people, DT to Suzuki, many great swamis, many great spiritual teachers, and he found this pattern of brainwaves called the awakened mind. And I share in the book what that awakened mind pattern looks like on an EEG. It's highly distinctive. We can take somebody, hook them up to an EEG, read their brain waves, and tell what their consciousness is like without knowing a single thing about them. We don't need to know their age, their psychological state, no testing. We can tell a lot about them just by the shape and the ratio of brain waves. So Maxwell Cade eventually developed a database of more than 20,000 scans of these enlightened masters, and they all show this awakened mind pattern. But his successor, a researcher called Anna Wise, then after Maxwell Cade retired, said, what if I hooked up a composer? What if I hooked up an athlete? What if I hooked up a brilliant scientist? So she began to hook up people who were in these elevated states, but were secular, were not necessarily meditators, weren't spiritual adepts. And she found that when they were in flow states, they had the awakened mind pattern, exact same pattern as spiritual masters. So these were architects, these were ballet dancers, these were people. And at the same time, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was doing his work on flow. Um, Other researchers before him, Abraham Maslow developed the pyramid of needs. The hierarchy of needs had begun to map people in transcendent states. And so when people are in these transcendent states who aren't meditators or aren't even spiritual, they might be atheists, they might be agnostics. We find that same pattern, and that's what's called flow, an experience in the EEG patterns, the awakened mind brain. So we find that people can enter the awakened mind either through meditation, the portal of spirituality, or through high performance, being in a flow state. And that those flow states are amazing. When we look at people in flow, they perform dramatically better than people who are just bumping around in caveman brain. Their financial performance, their work performance, their emotional intelligence, their IQ, all of those things rise dramatically when they're in those flow states. And that chapter of the book, chapter 5, is called Enlightenment Without Spirituality. You don't have to be a spiritual person. You can be an atheist or an agnostic. If you have the ability to enter flow, you can have that awakened mind pattern. And the cool thing about it is that I did one study because I wondered, we're getting people into these elevated states. We know we can do that, but are they then becoming worse at their jobs? Are they becoming detached from reality? Are they becoming um, emotionally separated from their families? Are they still engaged with their communities? What's happening when they're entering these elevated psychological states? And so I did one study where we looked at productivity. What's happening to these people when they go back to work and they have problems to solve and they have money to manage and they have projects and they have work? We found that spiritual intelligence produced a 20% rise in productivity in 3 weeks. In the first month of developing spiritual intelligence, these people were 20% more productive. When we measured them long term, they were 26% more productive. So that's like getting an extra day in your week. Other studies again have shown that bank managers who have spiritual intelligence are much more effective, and the financial results of their banks are better than bank managers without spiritual intelligence. Another study of massive industrial corporations found that the corporations where the hierarchy, people in management had high levels of spiritual intelligence, those companies had better financial results and grew better, had better employee retention, better employee satisfaction. So there are many studies now of spiritual intelligence showing that it doesn't just produce this elevated state, that it produces a flow state at work. Those people in flow do much better financially and materially in their workplaces. And that's chapter 5 of Spiritual Intelligence, Enlightenment Without Spirituality. When you're in flow during your day, it's called flow because your day just flows. That's that we it wasn't called flow by scientists. It was called flow by people like Maxwell Cade was studying. They said, those days when I'm in this elevated state, everything just flows. My day, it's just easy. And it is when you're in that flow state. So that's the big benefit is you become more productive, much happier, and you're in that flow state during your day after that early meditative experience in the morning.
So I wanted to say, you mentioned Hans Berger, the inventor of the EEG. He also famously said A machine can replace neither common sense nor intelligence. It's
Very,
that we
very
teach a
appropriate.
lot of students when we're teaching them medicine. We teach this. Um, you mentioned Jiddu Krishnamurti, and the first podcast in the Neurokrish Immersion series was about his awakening, his enlightenment moment. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, in fact, there are two questions I have. One is the ability to be awakened in some ways, at least for a proportion of people, and you mentioned a few spiritual greats, is it an endowed ability in the sense that they don't actually have to work too hard for it? That's the first question. And the second question I have in that regard is Jiddu Krishnamurti was a contemplator, not a thinker. He was not a meditator. And yet he possibly had his awakenings. Do contemplators and thinkers also have awakenings?
Wow, those are really big questions. And one of the things I don't know, so there are things that science can't prove. There's some things that are just beyond the ability of our tools to measure. And here's a question for you. So if you read the Vedas and the whole Vedantic philosophy, um, for example, Shankara in the crest jewel of discrimination talks about billions of lifetimes being required to awaken. And what Buddhism as well would argue is that that person who awakens, that Thich Nhat Hanh in the middle of the Vietnam War, this Buddhist monk, the Americans are dropping napalm on North Vietnam, and he awakens. Um, what the Buddhists and the Vedantists would say is that that's the result of those billions of lifetimes, or certainly many lifetimes of practice. And in the Sri Vidya philosophy, every single meditative moment, every single moment of spiritual intelligence is viewed in a lifetime, is viewed as preparation for physical death. When at the time of physical death, um, the local consciousness will exit the body, and the goal is a conscious death, is that the body dies, so you have that moment of Mahasamadhi, like Paramahansa Yogananda, when he just said to his followers one day, I'm leaving, and he walked into the ballroom, that's the Waldorf Astoria, actually, in Los Angeles, and he just walked into his room and sat there and entered Mahasamadhi and left his body. So they're leaving their bodies, they leave their bodies then with all of that, what the Buddhists would call spiritual merit or experience intact. They don't have amnesia, and they then enter the next incarnation with all of that there. So the argument in these philosophies is that um, the reason you awaken is that it's the result of many, many lifetimes worth of prior experience and spiritual development that is then coming to fruition in the current lifetime. And that's unprovable. I just don't know if that's true or not. Is it true or not true? There's no way of testing it. What I believe, in fact, what Ramana Maharshi, the great non-dualist sage, taught was that we can accelerate the process. And he had several people who took a lot of notes during his talks. And one of them was Arthur Osborne, another was Paul Brunton. And what they said was that we can, in a single deep meditation, burn off the karma of a previous lifetime. And in meditative practice, we can accelerate this, and it won't take us thousands or hundreds of lifetimes. So are these people awakening as a result of the merit of previous lifetimes? Can we do things that will accelerate awakening in this lifetime? And my personal, so I don't know the answer to these unanswerable questions. What I do know is that we can train people to enter these states by having them replicate the the um, physiological, emotional, spiritual practices of masters, and it can happen very, very quickly. And this hit home when I was doing one randomized controlled trial. This was a very, very ambitious study of a method called eco meditation that is scientifically based and really accelerates brain development very, very quickly. So we had one group doing eco meditation, one group doing a placebo. We measured their MRI function before and after 1 month. Okay, 1 month of doing eco meditation, 22 minutes a day. And when the neuroscience department of the university doing this study got the composite brain scans back after a month, they said, oh, we can see these are clearly the brain scans of Tibetan monks or nuns with over 10,000 hours of meditation practice when we looked at the before and after results. And then we said, actually, those are the brain scans of non meditators who meditated 22 minutes a day after 30 days. And they could not believe there was this degree of functional and structural anatomical brain change in only a month. So, what I believe science is giving us now, and again, some of these people who believe in the thousand lifetimes probably going to be be in vehement disagreement with this, but I think that now science gives us the tools to show it's effective. For example, if you look at all the styles of meditation there are out there, there are hundreds of different styles of meditation. We know from MRI studies that compassion produces neurogenesis quicker than any other meditative method. If you have compassion that's firing up your brain in certain ways, your brain will rapidly move into these elevated states with compassion. It moves the needle faster than anything else. We now know that through MRI studies. So science is giving us the insights to allow us to teach these methods to novices and have them very, very quickly move ahead. So I personally do not believe it takes thousands of lifetimes. I think we can take people, train them in these evidence-based tools, and have them move ahead very, very quickly in just a few weeks or months. So that's the question. That's my personal sense of it. And again, it does cut against though this ancient teaching that's to take us thousands of lifetimes to get there.
Wonderful. So I'm going to ask, as we come to the end of the podcast, your closing reflections. Uh, your message is on spiritual intelligence for our listeners and how people can evolve their own.
Obviously, you want to meditate. You just want to learn to prioritize meditation, if only for selfish reasons. If you just want an extra day in your week, you want that 20% productivity gain in 3 weeks, meditate. Now, do an evidence-based meditation. In spiritual intelligence, I distinguish between field meditations, and there are lots of meditative methods, but there are ones that are proven by science to very quickly result in neurogenesis and brain remodeling. So do those. And again, the book tells you how, gives you free links. It's easy to find them and to do it. The second thing is that you are likely to find your life changing very quickly if you make it a consistent practice. So what I have people do at the start of reading spiritual intelligence is I give them the challenge of meditating every day without fail for that 25 or so minutes and not skipping a day in 30 days. So that's what I recommend you do. I recommend you do this for 30 days. Now you might say, well, what if I get distracted? What if I drop a day? I can tell you if you use the tracks, the free audio tracks in the book, you're highly likely to do it for 30 days and more. I talked to one woman at a conference. She said, Dr. Church, I took your 30-day meditation challenge. I felt wonderful. I'd never been able to meditate before. I did it the first day. I felt great. I just decided to do the 30-day challenge. And I was so happy to hear that. And I said to her, what day are you on right now? She said, oh, I'm on day 164. I never missed a day. Now, why hasn't she missed a day? Well, it's because she feels so good. You have these elevated states, all that gamma in your brain, all these delicious neurochemicals like serotonin, dopamine, and anandamide. So you feel really good with these evidence-based meditations. So I recommend you meditate. Again, take that 30-day challenge. You're highly unlikely to ever stop Once you do that, because you feel so good, you become so resilient, so creative, and so happy. So that's the practical application of this. Meditate, develop spiritual intelligence, awaken that enlightenment network in your brain. Drop your stress, feel that happy, see your life shift, and then things began to change all around you. There's other research I talk about in the book showing how the material world around you begins to change. And so as you change, then as you change internally, the world around you changes externally. Ramana Maharshi said, if you want to change the world, start by changing yourself. Gandhi said much the same thing. And so that's really the place to start. You may want to be a world changer, like my children, my grandchildren are very concerned about the state of the planet. They want to make a difference, and some of them are doing work that is making a difference. By all means, do that external work, do the internal work initially, because when you do the internal work, you will find yourself doing inspired external work. Like right now, we're training therapists in Ukraine. We are working with veterans. We work with in our nonprofit with over 25,000 people with PTSD. So you find yourself doing external work that reflects your internal values, but again, it springs from this internal focus. So I know you want to change the world. Begin within. Start there. Begin to meditate. Make it non-negotiable every single day. You'll feel wonderful. And by that inner change, we will start to change the world. And I can tell you that spiritually intelligent, compassionate people are going to, in the next 10, 20, 50 years, we're going to see the last chapter of the book is about what's going to happen in the next few decades, what's going to happen in medicine and law and psychology and politics and the environment and science, technology. All of these things are going to change dramatically as spiritually intelligent people begin to enter those professions and shift them from the inside out. So we're going to be in a very different world. But again, it begins with you making that decision to meditate tomorrow for the next 30 days and very, very likely for the rest of your life.
Thank you for that very inspiring message, and I hope what all that you've said and all the knowledge that you have shared will help our listeners, evolve themselves into a greater degree of spiritual intelligence and raise their spiritual quotient. Dr. Dawson Church, it's been great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for making the time, and wonderful talking to you.
Thank you for those perceptive questions. Thank you for your wonderful work. It's making a big contribution to the evolution of this whole planet. So I deeply appreciate you, and thank you everyone for sharing this conversation.
Namaste.